Okay. Welcome everyone, I'm Heather Libby with the Knoxville Public Library. We're so thrilled to be able to host this voter education series, and we're grateful to Melissa Molloy for offering her time and her expertise. Let me admit somebody to the waiting room. I'm going to introduce your speaker now. Melissa is a 2015 graduate from Knoxville High School. She went on to major in International and Comparative Policy Studies at Reed College in Portland, Oregon. She focused her education on how policy impacts our communities and the society. And in her senior year, she spent 8 months researching and analyzing data on voter identification laws across the US. Her plans are to attend law school with an emphasis on election law or employment law starting in the fall of 2021. And she wants to continue to encourage voter participation in her community and beyond. Kicking off the series tonight is the session, Everything You Ever Wanted to Know About Voting and Elections in an Hour or Less. If you're like me, you've got a lot of questions and Melissa's got the answers. So I'm going to turn it over to her. She'll start by laying some important groundwork. Later on, there will be some time for activities and time for questions. So Melissa, the floor is yours.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for that delightful introduction. So like she said, my name is Melissa. I graduated from Knoxville in 2015, and I'm very excited to return here and just to be able to, talk about the things that I care about here in my community. One of the things that I am always excited to talk about is voting and elections. So the first class in this series, as was said before, is everything you ever wanted to know about voting and elections, or as much of it as I can say in an hour or less. Just as a bit of a disclaimer, I can't actually say everything you ever wanted to know about voting and elections in an hour or less. So I'm, hitting the highlights of stuff that I think are super important and a lot of people are aware of, but don't have very much of an in-depth knowledge about. And then I'll have some time for questions at the end for, if there's anything that you wanted to know about elections, but I didn't answer it. And I will either, let you know what I, know about it, or, I'll be honest with you if I don't know something, and I can either, research it independently and get back to you, or send some resources your way so that you can do some independent research. So with all that being said, just a brief overview of what we're going to talk about today. So this right here is the introduction. After this, I'm going to have a fun little question for you to get us warmed up and thinking about, the kind of things that you want to be thinking about for voting in elections. And then I'll have the presentation of itself, and then I'm reserving some time at the end for questions. And then, just kind of wrapping up, talking about the next classes in the series. So without further ado, a roadmap of the presentation itself. A disclaimer, this is not a history course. I'm not going to tell you, the year the Declaration of Independence was signed, the year the first election happened. You're supposed to learn that stuff in school. What I'm going to talk about is more the things that I think are important for you to know going into the elections. So, information about voting in Iowa, which I think is just really cool. Voting problems and voting solutions. So talking about the things that are important going into the elections, specifically regarding elections. So if you've ever heard about Citizens United and the battle over campaign finance, I'm going to talk about that. I'm going to discuss the Electoral College and whether it's important that we keep it or if it should be changed. And then just briefly address the idea of ballot security and ballot accessibility, because that is always a hot button topic. And then after that is when we're going to have questions. If during the presentation you have any questions, please feel free to send them to the chat, and I'll answer them at the end. Okay, so here is your little question. How long have women been able to vote nationwide in the United States? If you got an answer, you can go ahead and feel free to send it to the chat. I'll give you just a second. If you're thinking about this, you're probably like, oh, what year did that amendment get passed? And if you said 1920, you're right, but you're also wrong. So the 19th Amendment passed in 1920 really only granted white women ballot access in many states. Many women of color did have to wait until the Voting Rights Act was passed in 1965 or the amendments to the Voting Rights Act in 1975 to actually be able to vote. And there are a number of women across the country who still can't vote today, either because they're not allowed, because they don't have a physical address, or they have a felony conviction in some states, because that does bar you from voting in some places, or just because they can't easily access a polling place, either because they don't have the time or they don't have the resources to be able to either register or attend the voting. So that was just a little bit of a primer to introduce you to the idea that things are a lot more complicated than they seem. Okay, so first I want to talk about some voting information and statistics. So I'm going to talk about Marion County specifically, which is where we're at. I'm going to talk about Iowa, and then just as a couple comparisons across the United States. So first, here in Iowa, you can vote if you're a US citizen, if you're 18 years old, if you meet the state's residency requirements, and you are registered to vote. So you can't vote if you're not a citizen. So this includes lawful permanent residents. You have to be a naturalized citizen if you weren't born in the United States in order to vote. You can't vote if you've been judged mentally incapacitated or if you claim the right to vote in any other place. So that's the law, that you can only vote in one place, and that place is where you live. Talking about the Iowa electorate specifically, I got this wonderful chart from the United States Census Bureau. It looks at the voting age population. So this isn't the same as the number of people who are registered to vote, the number of people who cast a ballot in the last election, or even the number of people who are eligible to vote. This is just the voting age population, and this is essentially the most refined data I could find on it. And as far as the eligible population versus the voting age population, they are relatively similar. So something that I do want you to pay specific attention to right here is the voting age population by, the age itself. So you see 18 to 44-year-olds, it's almost half of the Iowa population, 45 to 64-year-olds, 34, and then 65 and over is 20%. So keep that little graph in mind as we move on to the next page and we see voter turnout. The first thing that I always notice when I look at these is that young people don't really vote that much. There's a lot of research and data on this talking about why young people don't vote. Some of it is they just don't feel like they know enough. They don't feel like they've been impacted by policy enough, that they care about politics, or, it hasn't been impressed upon them as to why it's important to vote. But overall, 69% of eligible voters in Iowa voted in the 2016 general election. You can see I have it also broken up by men and women. Women tend to vote at a little bit higher rate than men, although in Iowa this was reversed, and men who are over 65 voted at a slightly higher rate than women who are over 65. Pretty consistently across the history of voting in the US, the older people get, the more likely they are to vote. Some of that has to do with when you're retired, you have more time to vote and you have more time to care about politics, kind of stuff like that. And so to just compare with nationwide, in 2016, 60.2% of eligible voters voted. So that means that 40% of people who could have voted stayed home. That's like millions and millions of people. And 60.2% of people here decided what policies are going to impact every single person who lives in the United States. And for me, that's really powerful because, I wouldn't want policies to occur without me having any say in them, because they are going to impact me, whether I know about them, whether I care about them, or stuff like that. But that's a little bit more into my next presentation, which is going to be talking about why you should vote. Comparing across the country, Hawaii had the lowest voter participation rate in 2016 at 43% turnout, and Minnesota had the highest. Minnesota has consistently had the highest voter turnout, and they had 74.8% voter turnout. And so also looking at the 2018 elections, first thing you probably noticed here is that those bars went down. So it was a midterm election, which means that there was not a presidential candidate on the ballot. And generally there is lower turnout when there's not a president on the ballot, because people are not as inundated with ads and things. And people are more likely to care about voting for president, even though your voice matters more in local elections. And state level stuff. So 57% as opposed to 69% of eligible voters in Iowa voted in the 2018 general election. Once again, you see that delightful little age differential between young people and then people as they get older. And once again, you saw Hawaii had the lowest voter turnout and Minnesota had the highest. Nationwide, about half of eligible voters voted in the 2018 general elections. Okay, and I do also want to look at the primary turnouts, because primaries, which so few people vote in, are actually the places where your voice is best heard. If you have ever said that you don't like a specific candidate, then your opportunity to say that was in the primaries, when there are multiple candidates who have multiple different perspectives that are running for that office. And even if your candidate doesn't win within your party, there's a chance that, your candidate and having support, pushed the candidate that did win more in a direction that, you liked. We also did see a huge jump in primary turnout between 2016 and 2020 in Iowa. We went from 16% turnout in 2016, which is a presidential election year, to 40% in 2020. Once again, a presidential year. But this is like a huge jump. I looked at numbers, for the last several presidential elections, and about 16% is where it's hovered for several decades. The jury's out a little bit on why participation didn't jump so much, but it could have been the fact that the Iowa Secretary of State did send an absentee ballot request to every registered voter in Iowa for the primary election. So there's a chance that people didn't even realize there was a primary election coming up because the caucuses had already happened in February and they thought that it was done. So, on June 2nd, we had a 40% turnout as opposed to a 16% turnout as we've had in the past. And anyway, you should vote in the primaries. So next, I do want to talk a little bit about voting problems and voting solutions. So now, Citizens United is the first thing that I am going to talk about. Citizens United, the dark money revolution in election funding, it is, money is what makes the world go round. So we are going to talk about it. But first, pop quiz. What percentage of people in the US donate to political campaigns? Now, you might be thinking, oh, it's a lot of people. There's campaigns everywhere and politics is everywhere. Well, you might be surprised to find out that between 5 and 12% of people in the US donate to political campaigns. The estimates vary. This is from a PolitiFact article in early 2020 in January, after Andrew Yang said that 5% of people vote, and that was a fact check. So 5 to 12% of people voted or donated at all, but about 0.56% of the US population donated more than $200. $200 is the federal limit, at which point, if it's anything more than $200, the campaign receiving that money has to collect personal information about you. And 2/3 of the money donated directly to political campaigns comes from contributions higher than $200. So 0.56% of the US population contributes 2/3 of the money donated directly to political campaigns. This, however, does not include money donated to PACs or super PACs, which I'm about to talk about. So a little bit of background for you to lay the groundwork for Citizens United. In 1944, the first political action committee was formed. So it's a political committee organized for the purposes of raising and spending money to elect and defeat candidates. The first PACs were actually created by labor unions in the 1940s. The AFL-CIO had the first one. However, as time passed, increasingly they were more corporate rather than labor interest based. And then you can see some great posters from the early PACs there. And then in 1971, the Federal Election Campaign Act was passed. At that point, PACs had gotten really powerful in elections. So these were trying to limit the influence of political action committees because, Congress felt that the influence was too much and that the people's voices were being drowned out. So they created disclosure laws, which means that you can't secretly contribute to political action committees. So, if you're spending the big bucks, you need to own up to it. They capped individual donations to PACs to $2,500 by any one person in an election cycle. And they set limits on the donations that PACs could make directly to parties and campaigns. However, PACs moved to, instead of donating directly to campaigns and specifically advocating for a candidate, they moved to independent advertising to avoid spending limits and disclosure laws. And something you'll see is this becomes a pattern. A law is passed and funding weasels away around it to try and avoid disclosing and limiting the number of funds that they get to spend on elections. And then in 2002, once again to try and rein in the influence of money in elections, the McCain-Feingold Act was passed, also known as the Bipartisan Campaign Reform Act. So what this did, most importantly, it expanded disclosure laws, and it outlawed something called electioneering, which is political broadcasts within 30 days of a primary election and 60 days of a general election by political action committees. So to avoid this rule, the spenders created something called 527 organizations, and these advertised based on issues instead of on candidates. So they could avoid the new restrictions if they just didn't say the candidate's name. Okay, and then we have Citizens United versus the Federal Election Commission, or FEC. So the history of this, so there's a documentary in 2004 called Fahrenheit 9/11. It was a document that was critical of, the Bush administration's handling of 9/11. And so Citizens United, which is a corporate PAC, challenged that the ads for that documentary were actually political ads and that they were made for the purposes of influencing an election. However, the FEC did not agree, and they said that those advertisements could be placed because they didn't violate the electioneering laws that were established in the McCain-Feingold Act. So as a response, Citizens United formed a production company and made a film critical of Hillary Clinton and advertised it before the 2008 primaries. This was called Hillary the Movie. It was a film, it was released to pay-per-view. It wasn't really even shown on television, but they spent tons and tons of money on advertising for the film. And so they were challenged in court. They lost at the district level, and so they appealed to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court ruled in their favor, saying that they could in fact do that kind of advertising. And that could have been the end of it. They could have said, you could advertise for films and been done with it, but they actually made a much broader ruling than was necessary. And they essentially stripped the McCain-Feingold Act of anything that it had established. It reversed those electioneering limits. So there are now no restrictions on how closely to elections political ads can be run by PACs and other independent groups. So if you are tired of seeing so many political ads, that's Citizens United fault. And there's also now unlimited independent spending, so corporations and outside groups can spend unlimited funds on elections. There are no caps. It did rely on previous established ideas that money equals free speech. So the whole concept behind the Citizens United argument was that, spending that money was using their voice and therefore restricting their right to free speech. Any limits on independent campaign spending is a violation of the right to free speech according to this ruling. And then Citizens United versus FEC then combined with Speech Now versus FEC, which was passed several months later in a district court. And between these two decisions, super PACs were created. So super PACs are distinct from normal PACs in the ways that you can see on this little graph here. These are independent expenditure only groups. They eliminated the need for 527 groups because the restrictions, like I was saying in the McCain-Feingold Act, are gone. And then, so dark money groups also came out of this. So dark money groups, they collect money from donors, which then the group donates to a super PAC. The dark money groups are not required to disclose where their money comes from, and the super PACs only have to say that they got money from that group. So essentially, anyone who donates to that dark money group, it's a secret that they donated that money at all. And so, spending just got crazy after this decision. However, many people did expect that it would be corporations that would dump a lot of money into campaigns, but it was instead individual donations that spiked. So in 2012, shortly after the decision was passed, the top 100 individual donors contributed $339 million, but by 2016, that same top 100 donations or individual donors had gone up to 768 million. In 2010, the single largest donor donated $7.5 million in one election cycle. And by 2018, the largest single donor was 122 million. And this is only, of the disclosed amount. So there may be more that we don't know about, but this is what we know. And as a little benchmark for you, the average American makes $1 million in their entire life. So spending 7.5 and even $122 million on one election is a lot of money. And so what that means for elections, that small groups of ultra wealthy people have a disproportionate influence on elections. And it is harder for people who aren't rich to run for office. Why is that a bad thing? Money, it could be spent better elsewhere. Spending that much money in campaigns, not only is it does it have the potential of influencing elections and squashing the votes of people who don't have as much money? But it's just expensive. And it shuts out people who aren't rich from running for office, like I said. So if you have ever thought to yourself, I want a voice in politics that knows what us real people want, the person that you're looking for might not be the one that can pour hundreds of thousands of dollars, if not millions of dollars, into self-financing their own campaign. And that is increasingly something that is necessary given how expensive campaigns are. So what are some potential solutions to reducing the disproportionate impact results of Citizens United? So first and foremost, the disclosure of all political spending might help with this. So, curb dark money impacts by requiring full disclosure of political contributions, regardless of whether or not they're received by a campaign. So right now you only have to disclose money that is received eventually by the campaign, which is why the independent groups exist in the first place. But if you made it so that all money that goes, for political advertising or anything like that has to be disclosed, then that would be good. So there's also rules that you can't, as like super PACs and dark money groups and PACs, they cannot coordinate with campaigns, but it happens. It's kind of blatant. Like, the person who runs a super PAC might get, appointed to a cabinet position, or, they might've been best friends in college and then a super PAC suddenly appears. So it's illegal to coordinate between campaigns and these groups, but it happens, and it is barely enforced, that law is. So if you close those loopholes, it might assist in the reducing the impact of all that money. And then a third solution, which is the most radical, is the public financing of campaigns. So there's small donation grant matching, which works to increase the influence of small donations. So public money is used at a ratio, for instance, 1-to-1 or up to 1-to-6. So in New York, for every $1 that's pledged to a campaign at the state level, $6 is given to match that to the campaign that it's donated to, which makes, up to a certain limit. So like if it's more than $200, that matching goes away. But that is supposed to reduce the relative impact of big money versus small money. And then clean elections is the idea that campaigns would pledge to not raise any private funds in exchange for being given the full allowed amount to be spent on a campaign by the local government. So there's no outside influence can't exist because they don't get money from them in that idea. Okay. So, and then here's just a fun little quote I found when I was reading from an Iowan. So he's a former Republican congressman here from Iowa, Jim Leach, and he had to say about the Citizens United ruling, money has nothing to do with speech besides being used as a medium of exchange. It can buy words, but it can also buy influence, and it can be used to corrupt. This is all about power. So just some fun Iowan input. So now I'm gonna shift gears and talk about the Electoral College. I'm sure you learned about it in high school, but what is the Electoral College and why does it exist? So it exists as part of a compromise between founding fathers who disagreed on whether Congress or the American public should elect the president. There were many reasons why this compromise maybe had to be made. The idea that there was lack of nationwide information distribution so that the citizens themselves might not know who was the best candidate for president, the length of time that it would take to tally votes, across all of the states. There was, a distrust of the general public's competency in choosing a president. People were not very educated back then. Education was reserved for, an elite class of people, and they felt that they were the only ones who should be able to choose the president. And there is also the idea that choosing electors based on population instead of having a popular vote from eligible voters favored states in the South that were slave-owning states because they had big populations, but very few people there could vote because they didn't think, that slaves were people and therefore they couldn't vote. So that's kind of why it exists. And, the most distilled version of it is a vote for president is a vote telling your elector to vote for that candidate. So you're not voting for that candidate, you're voting for your electors to vote for that candidate. Okay, yep. Oh, and just some more about that. So each state gets as many electors as they have seats in both chambers of Congress. So, every state has at least 3 seats because they have at least 2 senators, because every state has 2 senators. and at least one representative. So Iowa has 6 because we have 2 senators and 4 representatives in Congress. And congressional seats are apportioned based on population. So that representation is roughly equal in Congress, but it's not totally equal. There are some states that have disproportionate power. And the winner of the popular vote in each state wins every electoral college vote for that state, with the exception of Maine and Nebraska, no matter the margin of victory. So if one candidate gets 50% of the votes plus 1 vote, they get 100% of the electoral college vote, which, you know, kind of isn't too great in my opinion, because, you know, that other 49.99999% of people, their voice wasn't heard. However, most of the time throughout history, the Electoral College has agreed with the popular vote, except when it doesn't. So when the people in the Electoral College don't agree, and you can see my picture here, the Electoral College kicking the popular vote, because the Electoral College always wins. So the winner of the popular vote has lost the presidency 5 times in US history. 3 of those occurred before 1900, and the last 2 have happened since 2000, so in 2000 and 2016. One of these that I think is important to note was the notorious Rutherford B. Hayes versus Samuel Tilden race in 1876. Part of that compromise in Hayes taking the presidency was that all of the Northern troops were pulled out of the former Confederate Southern states, which ended the Reconstruction era. The loss of Northern protection meant physical and political violence that reversed all of the gains that African Americans had made in the South. There were thousands of Black people in Congress and voting in the South before Reconstruction, and then those numbers essentially disappeared after, you know, Jim Crow laws were enacted, after the KKK started killing people, you know, and stuff like that. So that came out of the Electoral College and the people not agreeing. And people have a problem with the Electoral College. You know, in the history of the US, over 700 bills or amendments have been proposed to abolish the Electoral College. So that's a lot. Okay, so the Electoral College, pros and cons. So should we keep it or kick it? Keep it. The Electoral College and the popular vote match most of the time. But when they disagree, it's a big problem, as I just mentioned. So there's the idea that implementing a popular vote system would present unpredictable challenges, and that's true. There would be an adjustment period, and, you know, unforeseen challenges that we wouldn't, you know, be able to expect, and we'd have to deal with those at the time, and it might cause uncertainty. However, there's also the idea that short-term challenges are better than the Electoral College collecting a candidate who lost the popular vote. Perhaps the biggest concern is the idea that rural areas will be left out because candidates will then focus on population centers. I know here in Iowa, we would worry about that a lot because we are relatively rural and we don't have a lot of people, but we do have, you know, a really big voice in elections because of when our caucuses are. However, when you look at the data, after the primaries, candidates already largely focus on cities and battleground states anyway. So that concern is in a way largely unfounded. The primary and caucus system would stay the same. The Electoral College has nothing to do with the primaries. So here in Iowa, we'd have that same power that we've always had of being the first state to have its primary/caucus. And then, like I said, yeah, after the primaries, candidates still don't really care about us anyway. So, and yeah, people in cities are people too. So, and also an argument for keeping it is it's nearly impossible to amend the Constitution, especially in a divided political climate. The mismatch between the Electoral College and the popular vote has twice in the last decade benefited Republicans. So the potential that, you know, both parties would be able to agree on some form that eliminates the effect of the Electoral College on elections is highly unlikely, especially right now. And that's true. Yeah. And there's really nothing to say about that other than, you know, you could potentially make changes to the Electoral College without abolishing it, in which case you wouldn't need a constitutional amendment. And I am going to talk about one of those in a second. And then one of the other reasons to get rid of the Electoral College would be that advances in technology have just made it obsolete. We don't have problems anymore with not being able to tally votes quickly or to be able to spread information. You know, all that happens essentially in the blink of an eye compared to how it was when the Electoral College was formed. Okay, so, and I do want to just highlight a little thing that's happening. So there's something called the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact. So it's the idea that signatory states would agree that their electoral votes would be cast for the winner of the popular vote, which would mean that the winner of the popular vote would always also win the Electoral College. And it doesn't kick in until the total votes that are pledged would reach 270. So states aren't at risk of losing their electoral votes until, the compact goes into place. 15 states and Washington, D.C. have currently joined. So that means that 196 electoral college votes are pledged. 270, once again, is the threshold to win the presidency. So we are missing a number of them. And then, you would need cross-party support, in states controlled by both Democrats and Republicans in order to reach that 270. So, but that's the thing. And so now I do want to address voter fraud, voter suppression, and ballot accessibility. And just some data here for you from the Pew Research Center. So 91% of Americans believe the right to vote is an essential part of personal freedom, and 67% believe that everything possible should be done to make it easy for every citizen to vote. So that's just a little framing for you as I move into discussions. So the first thing I want to talk about is physical failures in voting. This is a huge problem. Elections are underfunded, especially during the coronavirus crisis right now. States need so much more money to be able to accommodate the changes that need to happen. But in general, in 2018, 31 states reported having a desperate need to replace equipment in one or more districts before the 2020 elections. That data is saying that 31 states, have districts that their equipment just doesn't work. They need new equipment before the 2020 elections, and 2/3 of those districts said that they did not have the money to do so. So they don't know what they're going to do when elections come because they can't really count their ballots. There's also problems with machines just like stopping working in the middle of voting day, which causes huge backups in voting and prevents people from voting because they don't have 6 or 8 hours to wait in line for this old machine to get fixed that parts don't exist for anymore. As well as, that's not what I wanted. Other physical failures in voting between 2012 and 2018, nearly 1,700 polling places were closed across the South, forcing more people to vote in fewer locations. Here in rural Iowa, it's nice. We don't have to wait very long to vote, but people, in populous areas have to wait 4 hours in line or more to vote. And some people just don't have the capacity to do that. And that is a physical failure because people should have easy access to the ballot. Other physical failures include the notorious 2000 Florida recount. So there's the poorly designed butterfly ballots that you can see up there. They are incredibly confusing. So a lot of people may have voted for the wrong candidate, and their voice was therefore not accurately heard in that election. So, you can see up there the Reform Party, their little dot is right next to where it says Democratic. So the Reform Party in that county did get a lot of votes. And perhaps they were really popular, or perhaps those people meant to vote for Al Gore, which, that county was essentially what decided the election and is why Bush was president from 2000 to 2008. There's also in Florida also there's a problem of hanging chads, which is where the ballot boxes were so full of little punches that people would try to punch out their ballots and they couldn't get the little dot to disappear. And so you can see this guy on the bottom, he is examining with a magnifying glass someone's ballot to determine which candidate they voted for because the hole is not all the way punched through. And just in addition, underfunded polling places are concentrated in poor neighborhoods. So if you're in a wealthy suburb, you're very unlikely to encounter any of these problems. They have advanced voting technology because they have the public funding to make it happen. And that produces inequality in voting. And, it makes it so that some people's voices can't be heard. So I do also want to talk about voter fraud, because you've probably heard about voter fraud. What it is any misrepresentation, whether it's intentional or not, of one's identity or information that generates a vote that would not otherwise be counted. So since 2000, there have been about 1,000 voter fraud convictions across the United States, according to the Heritage Foundation, which is obsessed with voter fraud, so they would know. By comparison, however, I know 1,000 sounds like a lot. Over 1 billion votes have been cast since 2000. So that means that 1088% of those votes were potentially fraudulent, which is really not, and it's not a lot, and that would sway like maybe like a handful of elections over time because they were exactly tied. So other forms of election tampering, such as machine hacking, are separate from regular discussions of voter fraud, and things like voter ID requirements and purging of voter rolls does not address hacking, and things like that. So that isn't what I'm considering voter fraud for the purposes of this. So addressing ballot security, like what can we do to make sure that we know that our ballots feel secure? Because even if fraud isn't a huge problem, Americans still worry about it, and they want to feel like their vote matters, because everyone else is equally, verified as is who they say they are. So voter ID laws have swept across the United States in the last 20 years. I did a lot of research on it. Voter ID is viewed favorably by 76% of Americans. Democrats, Republicans, independent of party, people think that, having an ID is a reasonable request. So forms of valid ID vary across states. There are some problems with, for instance, if there's a state where there's a very high rate of Native Americans, if a tribal ID card is not considered a valid ID card, that might prevent them from being able to vote, versus like if there's a college town and most people have their student IDs, maybe that should be considered a valid ID, but it's not standardized across states because every state has their own laws, and there's different strictness as well. One of the things about voter ID is that there are people who don't have identification. There are people who don't have driver's license or state IDs, and those are concentrated in amongst lower socioeconomic standing. So something about voter ID is, in addition to implementation of voter ID, I do believe that ID should also be made easily financially and logistically available. So if you have to get a state ID, but you have to take a bus for 3 hours to get there, and you have to pay a bunch of money to get an ID, some people just aren't going to do that, just to be able to vote. So like they potentially could vote, but maybe they won't because it presents too much of a burden. So something else that would make ballots more secure is automatic voter registration updates, which just means that anytime you interact with a government agency, your registration is updated. I think that should already be happening because the government already knows where you live. It already knows if you die, everything like that. But right now it's on the voter in most places to be the one that updates that. And what that results in is addresses being old and not updated, so you're accidentally voting in the wrong place, or states who decide to purge their voter rolls based on if they think too many dead people are on there, if there are too many wrong addresses. Those unfortunately mistakenly remove thousands of voters from rolls, and they show up at their polling place on election day and find out that they are not registered to vote, and that prevents them from voting. So automatic voter registration updates, a good thing. You could also expand the number of polling places to reduce the possibility of oversight. So if you have fewer people coming through a polling place, the less likely they are to, be people who could perpetrate fraud, because you're more likely to recognize them and more able to pay attention to them. As well as there are some states that don't have paper trails on their voting machines. Increasingly, funding is being requested to replace ballot machines so that there are paper trails, so that you can do a manual recount if necessary, and that also helps to reduce the risk of hacking. Okay, so just a little side note on voting by mail, since we are discussing voter fraud. Mail-in votes and absentee votes are the same thing. The only exception to this is in-person absentee voting or early voting, which we do have here in Iowa. But essentially, when you request an absentee ballot, you are requesting a mail-in ballot. They are the same thing. And even if every registered voter in the US voted by mail, it would still be fewer ballots than Christmas cards are sent every year. So USPS does have the capacity to adequately deal with all of those ballots that are going to be coming in. However, if you are worried about your ballot arriving on time, you should return it to your county auditor's office or at a designated ballot drop. Check in your area specifically, but some places don't allow you to take your ballot to the polling places. Most places don't. So I would suggest, like I said, either mailing it, turning it into the county auditor, or a designated ballot drop. I do want to address the idea of fraud in voting by mail. It is slightly higher in mail-in ballots than in person, but it is still essentially non-existent. So that 1,000 that I mentioned earlier, that is 0.0001% of votes cast, that includes every fraud through mail-in ballot. And there are several states also that have universal mail-in voting, so they automatically mail people's ballots to them. They have no higher rates of voter fraud than other states without vote-by-mail systems, and these are both predominantly Democratic and predominantly Republican states that have these laws. And like I said, there's no more fraud. And if you're thinking about voting by mail and then attempting to vote in person, don't do it. It is a felony. You could get fined like $7,000 and spend 5 years in prison. So I would not recommend trying it. Okay, ballot accessibility. So here's just a couple things that could help improve ballot accessibility. And they also work really well to help reduce the possibility of fraud. So I talked earlier about automatic voter registration updates, AVR and motor voter laws, which we have here in Iowa, it's once again, whenever someone interacts with a government agency, their voter information is updated. Most often this is the DMV. So in Iowa, you can register to vote when you get your 18-year-old driver's license. I know I did, I checked that box. We also have same-day voter registration here in Iowa. That means that you can register to vote and vote on the same day. I don't know about you, but from like most things, if I had to register like 30 days in advance to go do a thing, I wouldn't do it. I just wouldn't show up. And that's what same-day voter registration is trying to get at. If you suddenly get passionate about an election, like 5 days before an election, just because you didn't have that knowledge 30 days ago, shouldn't prevent you from being able to vote. And then just generally, once again, expanded funding for elections to replace old machinery and to open new polling places. And this, like I mentioned earlier, also improves ballot security by generating a paper trail and improving, the worker capacity to address potential fraud. And as you can see here, I got this lady here. She's really excited she got to vote, and she has her I voted sticker. Okay, and then here's just one more little policy proposal that didn't really fit in any of my categories, but I absolutely love it. So ranked choice ballots. The current system is you choose one candidate. So, if there are a bunch of candidates, you still only get to choose one. So even if someone was a close second for you, you only get to choose one. And sometimes that means that you don't choose the candidate that's actually your favorite. You choose the candidate who you think is most likely to win. And the candidate who gets the most votes wins, the end. Except when they don't get 50% of the vote, or there's no clear winner, in which case you have to have a runoff election, which is a whole huge hassle because it's an entire other election. So in comes ranked choice ballots. So you rank candidates according to your preference. So for instance, if here on this little ballot on the side here, you like candidate B the most, you mark B, and you like candidate A the second most, or A, second, 1, 2, 3. Pretty easy stuff like that. And so, first time through the way this works on the election is the first time ballots are looked at, they only look at first rank. And if someone wins 50% of the first rank votes, great, they're the winner. But if no one wins 50%, what they do is the candidate with the least support is eliminated. And then their votes go to whoever the second choice was. So for instance, if I voted for candidate B as my first choice, but candidate B only got like 5% of the vote, my vote would then go to candidate A. And then, if that pushes one candidate over 50%, they win, and so on until you run out of the ballot. And this is good for a number of reasons. First of all, it makes third-party candidates more viable. John Adams, one of our favorite old guys, said a division of the republic into two great parties is to be dreaded as the great political evil. And you hear a lot of folks these days talking about how they think that, they don't like Democrats or Republicans. They want to vote third party, but there just aren't enough people voting third party that essentially voting for a third-party candidate is wasting your vote because there are so many people elsewise. And being able to vote for the candidate that's your favorite, but then also, choosing one as your second candidate who you think is more likely to win, but perhaps you like less, then that's better, because if you really, really, really don't like candidate C, at least that your vote is going to go to candidate A before it goes to candidate C. And it also does discourage mudslinging and negative ads, which I'm sure you're all very familiar with at this point. Because, for instance, if I like candidate, if candidate A is advertising and they just say like these really mean stuff about candidate B, then I'm not going to rank them as my second choice because they are saying bad things about the candidate that's my favorite. So it encourages more positive elections instead of negativity, because you want to bring as many people along with you so that you can at least get their down ballot votes. Okay, so that's all of the structured content that I have. We have just a couple minutes for questions that anyone might have. You know, I reserve this time. This session is about everything you ever wanted to know about voting in elections, after all. So if you have any questions, go ahead and send them to the chat, and Heather is going to read them, and I will do my best to answer. So I'll give you just a couple minutes. And I can't see the chats, so if there's anything coming in, Heather, you will have to tell me. Heather, you're muted.
Okay, sorry. Yeah, I'm not seeing anything in chat yet, but while people are gathering their thoughts, I had a question. So you just ended on ranked choice ballots, and that was fascinating. I'm curious though, what's the likelihood of, in your view, of that being an option for major elections? Or is there a process that individual citizens could pursue to try to campaign for this? Has that been something that you've looked into?
Actually, yeah, I appreciate you asking, because there are several states that on some races do have ranked ballots already. Some of these, I can't remember specifically. I know Maine is one of them. But so that they already have ranked choice ballots, and they were voted in by popular initiative. So I think it's Maine. They started with it provisionally one year, and one of the questions on their ballot was, do you like this, should we keep it? And voters did vote to keep it because they liked that system. So it is something that has already been enacted at the state level and at local levels. So it's just a matter of popularizing it in your community and trying to gain public support, both to bring it up with your legislators to have them potentially introduce, you know, something to the legislature, or to get enough signatures. If you are super excited about this idea, get enough signatures to get it on the ballot and voted in by popular initiative. So it is definitely a thing that exists, just not a lot of people know about it, which is why I wanted to talk about it, because I love ranked choice ballots.
Yeah, interesting. Anyone else have anything? I don't want to steal all the questions. I guess I had another that was similar, kind of how likely is it, how do we do this? So going earlier in your presentation, when you were talking about some of the ways that we can come up with solutions for reducing disproportionate impact, and you listed, like, you know, the public financing of campaigns, right? So these all seem like great possible solutions, but what's the likelihood of them actually being implemented? Or is there something that we can do to get the ball rolling? Maybe this is actually looking ahead at your next presentation. So if so, you know, we can set it aside for them. But does that make sense, the question?
Yeah, it does. So once again, the different initiatives that I've talked about, every one of them has been implemented somewhere. They're usually just more at the local or the state level, and they don't have national attention yet. So as far as for instance, the public campaign financing, the grant matching, where, you know, private dollars that have been donated up to a certain amount get a match in a ratio from public funding, those exist much more widely than the public financing option, or the clean election option, that is. So for instance, the city of New York has a 1-to-6 match rule, and there are other places across the country that I don't know off the top of my head, but have implemented something along those lines to try and reduce the impact of disproportionate, you know, funding in elections. One of the ways also that you can combat it more on a local level is by doing a voter education program, or educating yourself and educating your peers and your family and your friends and your colleagues about how to find accurate information in voting, so that they can sort through all the noise that you get from the political ads that are being put out by super PACs, so that people can get to the heart of the information and make their own form their own opinions based on, you know, accurate information that's out there.
right. Well, I'm not seeing any other questions at the moment, but we also have a few more sessions ahead of us. So if anybody has any in the interim, this is a lot of great information to sort through, but I think our brains might need to process it for a while. So bring your questions to later sessions. You can always email them to us at the library too. We can pass them on to Melissa. But if that's that, I'll just thank everybody so much for coming tonight. We have recorded tonight's session, so we'll have that available later. So you can go back, review, you can share it with your friends. Next week, we'll be meeting again, and we're going to be talking about why your vote matters, the case for voting, even when it feels like a waste of your time. And so I think that's great. We can all use some inspiration. Melissa, anything else?
No, I mean, that's all I have. Thank you so much
Okay.
for coming up today, and we hope to see you all next week.
All right, that's great. All right, we'll see everyone later.